Okay. Hello, good morning everybody. Thank you for coming. We're going to make a start just now. We've got an interesting set of discussions. I'm going to pass immediately, and we'll build on some of the themes that I think we began to explore yesterday in a very, very excellent panel that we had. Very, very kind of lively and passionate. I really enjoyed that. And I'm going to pass immediately to Sally Mapstone, who is the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of St Andrews University, one of our new members. Delighted to see you again. Thank you so much for chairing this session. Sally.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul, and it really is a delight for the University of St Andrews to have joined the family of the Europaeum. So, hello everybody. We're aiming for a lively session this morning, which I'm sure many of us feel in need of after last night. And the focus of today's session is following on very much from some of the discussion that we started yesterday. How do we safeguard free speech on campus? So just to talk to you momentarily about the format. In a minute, we're going to hear some introductory remarks from Alan Rusbridger, known to everybody, I'm sure, as the former editor of The Guardian, and now for the past 2 years, the principal of Lady Margaret Hall, here, one of the constituent colleges of the university. And then after Alan has spoken, we will hear from our discussants, Professor Philippe Laura, the director of the Graduate Institute at Geneva and a distinguished historian, and Professor Hans van Es, president of the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich, vice president. My apologies. I promote people naturally. It's a very
Thank you so much.
It's a very it's a kind of natural positivity that everybody should just go onwards and upwards. Vice president, thank you so much for that, and a distinguished sinologist. And we will then, I hope, have the opportunity to open up our discussion on free speech on campus to all of you. And just to say from my own experience, the question of free speech is something in our campuses is a really, for all of us, I think, a really live issue. And we find ourselves contending with some very interesting challenges. How do we reconcile our commitment to free speech on campus with an interest in the security and safety of all the cohorts there? How do we balance free speech within the context of the regulatory frameworks with which we have to work, both in the sector and nationally? And we heard some points about that in the very interesting discussion yesterday. But also, how do we think about how do we define free speech, and how do we get into, and when necessary, explore those areas where there may be, and I think we've probably all experienced this, difference in definitions and in ways of thinking about aspects of free speech between generations, between our students and those of us who have the responsibilities for running our institutions. So I expect some or all of these questions will come up today, but without further ado, let's get started, and let's move on to hearing from our opening speaker, Alan Rusbridger. Alan, over to you.
Well, thanks, Sally, and well done for getting up at this hour on a Saturday morning. I feel slightly abashed at speaking on this subject because I still think of myself as being very new to Oxford and to academia, though I've been here for 2 years now. And I spent most of my working life, as Sally said, not in universities, but in a parallel world, which was very much preoccupied with freedom of expression, but in a different context, and that of journalism. So I thought I would approach the subject today in a slightly lateral way. In the context of journalism, most of you will be aware the story is not necessarily an encouraging one in some ways. And last year I went to Kenya on behalf of the Committee to Protect Journalists and saw how free expression in one country that was a relative beacon of good practice was being cynically stifled by a government. And then this year I went to Ukraine again for the CPJ and found many journalists living in an atmosphere of fear because, as in Kenya, there's a creeping self-censorship which becomes more noticeable because and journalists are being killed with impunity. And the same picture is evident in many parts of the world now. It's not much fun being a journalist or a blogger in Russia or Turkey or Venezuela or India or Bangladesh or Mexico or Iran or Saudi Arabia. They're all places where to exercise your right to free speech can cost you your life. And I think all those countries are a reminder, a daily reminder of what we may have forgotten, that freedom of expression is so precious. It's always been and continues to be, people can't hear, something that people will die for. But in a way, it's even more alarming to see the president of what was once held up to be a country that was the pinnacle of free expression, routinely going out of his way to delegitimize those who try to tell us what is true and what is untrue. He routinely tries to blur any distinction between true and false, between fake and real. If the New York Times, which is one of the best newspapers in the world, is fake, then everything is fake. And journalism, the craft, the institutional weight, the independence that gives it authority, all these count for nothing. And nothing can be relied to be true or false. And where that leads in a democratic country is a dark thing to consider. We're reminded that freedom of expression is never a given, even in the places which appear most attached to it. The fight is never, in inverted commas, won. There's no point of arrival. It's something constantly to be argued over, to be discussed, and to be defended, which is why we're here today. Now, of course, journalists are all in favour of freedom of expression. We think it's a good thing, but we have constant debates about how free really is or should be. As in academic life, it's an immensely complicated question. It was illuminating to watch a clever High Court judge like Mr. Justice Leveson recently grappling for 2 years, 2,000 pages and 1 million words to try and work out how free should be in the context of the British press. I used to have long discussions with the distinguished American legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin about this issue. And he was something of a fundamentalist. To him, free speech was free speech. He thought British attempts to regulate the press were ridiculous. He didn't like rules or laws inhibiting hate speech or offensive speech or speech that intruded into privacy. He was with John Stuart Mill. The best response to argument is more argument. But that's not where the English law or regulation landed. We do think there should be restrictions on some kinds of speech. We have thought that it was wrong to allow people to incite hatred or violence against other people on grounds of ethnicity or race or sexuality, for example. There are laws against it. The age of Brexit and Trump, though, has led some people to believe in these restrictions even more strongly, and others have been led to question them. To some, the rise of so-called populist leaders and movements has unleashed and legitimised hatreds that were better unexpressed. To others, Brexit and Trump were manifestations of what happens when free expression is suppressed. To them, political correctness has blocked the safety valve of being free to speak your mind, and the result has been an ugly explosion of pent-up anger, and we liberals are to blame. During my editing life, I did my best to use, but not, I hope, misuse the relative freedoms we enjoy in this country. We believed in our right to free expression, but we regularly made judgments not to exercise it. At the time of the appalling massacre in the offices of Charlie Hebdo, I defended, of course, the right of the magazine's editors to publish offensive and tasteless cartoons. But I didn't want to use those cartoons myself. I commissioned articles from Sinn Féin to write for The Guardian at a time when those leaders were considered by many to be beyond the pale, as well as many representatives from various Middle Eastern political or terror organizations or groups that span both politics and terror. Osama bin Laden once had a byline in The Guardian. I invited into the pages people who had very different points about immigration or even climate change. Perhaps the hardest subject I tried to explore was paedophilia. Condemning paedophilia was easy. Trying to understand its causes or treatments was almost beyond the pale. But I commissioned those pieces because I thought we should try to understand the motivations of groups and individuals outside the political or cultural consensus. If you didn't hear these people or try to understand them, how could you ever effectively argue with them or repudiate them, or contradict them, or cure them, or contain them, or, where appropriate, negotiate with them? Sometimes these pieces caused offence, sometimes outrage, sometimes they led to lost subscribers. But more often, I think, to gain subscribers, because happily there are many people who want to be challenged, to embrace complexity, to be asked to imagine an argument or a case that's the opposite of what they themselves believe or think they believe. Someone once described publishing such pieces as biting the hand that reads you, and I always saw that as an important element of the job. My last big story on The Guardian was to publish disclosures based on the material leaked by Edward Snowden, a story which I published even though there was a reasonable chance of going to prison for it. I was with Judge Gerfin and Mr. Justice Black in the famous 1972 Pentagon Papers trial, in thinking that security lay, quotes, not at the ramparts alone, but also in the value of our free institutions. As Gerfin said in dismissing the attempt of the Nixon administration to injunct the New York Times, a cantankerous press, an obstinate press, a ubiquitous press, must be suffered by those in authority in order to preserve the even greater values of freedom of expression and the rights of the people to know. And yes, I did love my country, and I loved it because it was a place where, by and large, free expression was generally not just tolerated, but cherished. And in the end, editors generally didn't go to prison for what they commissioned or what they wrote. And then I came to the Academy, the bastion even more than the press of those freedoms. But as today's gathering shows, there are the same doubts and confusions of what should be, in inverted commas, allowed, and a fear that partly in seeking to minimize offence, we should narrow the scope of what is sayable or writable or discussable or arguable. Now, I should say straight away that I personally have yet to encounter anything in Oxford or Lady Margaret Hall that has tried to limit the freedom of thought and expression that I expected when I moved into the world of universities. But of course I've read the same things as you've read and have maybe experienced, because scarcely a day passes without reading stories about no platforming, safe spaces, trigger warnings, disinvited speakers, forced cancellations, fellowships awarded and then withdrawn. A New York Times columnist recently lamented what he called the dying art of disagreement, and he wondered why this should be so, since the evidence seemed to be that ours was also said to be the most polarized age in recent memory, an age of furious disagreement. Many reasons are advanced. Some blame social media and its so-called filter bubbles. Some blame the mainstream media. Fox News, for example, was watched by 40% of Trump voters. Some complain that we no longer have a common set of facts on which we can base our disagreements. A US president who encourages people to disregard the best evidence is part of the problem. Some want to blame the rise of identity politics, or students raised in a culture of individualism. Some look at the high levels of anxiety and depression measured among young people and think it's little wonder they want to create safe spaces in their lives and that they want more black and white rules to help navigate the greys. A writer in the Financial Times last week contrasted the present spirit of the age, if that's what it is, with the 1960s, when the urge was to push back boundaries, to engage in transgressive behaviour, to explore and to experiment. But it's not just the students. There are other systemic trends within education which are of concern. Does the narrowing of an exam-driven school curriculum allow young minds enough exposure to arguments about civics? Are funders of higher education institutions and research too ready to pull hidden strings? Has the Research Excellence Framework, the REF, as a currency of value, introduced a much-needed rigorous framework for research, or just created a faceless and opaque bureaucracy of managerial constraint? Many academics share anxieties about the rise of Islamist indoctrination and terrorism, while not wanting to be seen as monitors, censors, or spies. The academics I talk with view many of these trends with some alarm. There's an anti-intellectualism to what's going on that worries them. As the writer of the New York Times pointed out, what used to be called a liberal education involved cultivating the habits of an open mind, to listen and to understand, to question and disagree, to treat no proposition as sacred and no objection as impious, to be willing to entertain unpopular ideas and cultivate the habits of an open mind, to see that every great idea is really just a spectacular disagreement with some other great idea. No one I know wants Oxford to be accused, as Harvard has recently been, of wanting a campus where everyone looks different but thinks alike. In order to disagree well, you first have to understand well. Only by comprehending the views your intellectual opponent can you confront and hopefully rebut, or even destroy them. But of course, we should also be sensitive to identities and to difference. We didn't publish the Charlie Hebdo cartoons because we never published cartoons like that in The Guardian. Cartoons which sometimes seemed designed to cause offence. We published many great things which did cause offence, but causing offence was never an end in itself. As The Guardian writer Gary Young said after Charlie Hebdo, there's no contradiction between supporting someone's right to do something and condemning them for doing it. So of course we should be sensitive and to understand. But the best understanding, as I said, flows from engaging with and then the testing of arguments and identities. Meet argument with more argument, with better argument, win the argument. I asked a group of students the other day who they would consider beyond the limit. Who would they ban? The alt-right, one answered. People like Steve Bannon and Milo Yiannopoulos, the so-called internet supervillain. Really, I thought? Are we so frightened of taking on clowns like Milo, who delights in every attempt to demonize and silence him? An attention-seeking double university dropout from Kent, who until comparatively recently could only find a berth as a professional troll in the Daily Telegraph's blog pages. Can't we see that he longs to be banned, that suppressing his voice feeds the only notoriety he could hope for, and on which he's built a personal brand? We're surely not frightened of confronting such a figure on open ground. If anyone now remembers the appearance of Nick Griffin, the far-right British National Party leader on Question Time, the BBC, in 2009, they'll surely only remember how pathetic he seemed when forced out into open debate. The programme attracted 8 million viewers, a fact which was used to argue that he should never have been granted airtime. In the subsequent general election in 2010, the BNP fielded more than 300 candidates and failed to win a single seat. By 2015, the party fielded 8 candidates and was beaten by the Cannabis is Safer Than Alcohol party and the monster Raving Loony party. By 2017, fewer than 5,000 voters nationally could be found to vote for the BNP, which was now behind the Yorkshire Party or the Christian People's Alliance. The BNP's official share of the vote was 0.0%. That's how much Griffin impressed the British people. The only thing that would have worked for him would have been to ban him. The more the universities no-platformed him, the more his popularity would have risen. How do we safeguard free speech on campus? Well, we have to convince people that it works, like with Nick Griffin. It works for the positive reasons held by Mill and his followers. The collision of adverse opinion leads to the survival of the true. Whoever knew truth put to worse in a free and open encounter, said Mill. And we have to convince people that the reverse is also true. The more people feel they are not allowed to say things, or are prevented from knowing things, or that the small L liberal consensus is too threatened to tolerate dissent, the more that leads to suspicion and the growth of movements that are the opposite of what a university stands for. As I say, I have not personally experienced any such restrictions since arriving in Oxford. I did witness a certain amount of confusion over the calls for a small statue of Cecil Rhodes to be removed from the facade of Oriel College, where it had stood for several decades with no one noticing him. That seemed to me a reasonable debate to have, and one that has, if anything, gained more salience in the light of recent parallel controversies in the United States over the meaning of monuments and statues. Rhodes wasn't Robert E. Lee, but he was a controversial figure even in his own lifetime. Anyone who thinks that the Rhodes protesters were guilty of rewriting history with the benefit of hindsight should read the Manchester Guardian's obituary of him on March the 27th, 1902. It ended, "The judgment of history will, we fear, be that he did more than any Englishman of his time to lower the reputation and impair the strength and compromise the future of the empire." The questions of whom we honour is a fascinating and live one. Only the day before yesterday, another Oxford college not far from here removed a portrait of one of its distinguished alumni from its walls. The governing body of St. Hugh's has decided to move Aung San Suu Kyi into storage. Some think that's sensitive, others think it's cowardly. I personally didn't think Rhodes must fall in Oxford, but I was glad that we had the discussion and that we took the argument seriously. I didn't personally feel the campaigners for the statue's removal were closing down debate. I thought they were opening up valid arguments about history and about Oxford and diversity. The debate was had in the open, and many of us profited from it, even if the ultimate aim of the protesters was, in the views of many, misdirected. As Tim Garton-Ash said in The Guardian, "This is a perfectly legitimate debate about the politics of memory." He added, "Thank you, Rhodes must fall, for violating my safe space." Many journalists in many countries live at the sharp end of this debate. For them, it is not, to use one meaning of the word, an academic issue. But universities are also in the front line of this debate, and today's conference is a very useful and timely intervention in it.
Thank you very much, Alan, for opening up the debate by drawing on the relationship between the two words that you highlighted, and for throwing down the gauntlet in terms of how do we safeguard freedom of speech on campus by arguing that we should convince people that it works. So let's get the discussion going, and let's turn to our first discussant, Hans Venus, if you would like to either go to the podium or speak from the stage, whichever you prefer.
Well, maybe then, since I did prepare something, not knowing what you were going to say, I'm still going to the podium and speak from this place here. I was just asked whether I was going to say something on China, and I said no. I actually did not intend to. Do I need the microphone, or do you? Yes, it's better. Okay. So, okay. And I said no. I'm not going to talk about China, although this would have been an interesting subject, especially since yesterday evening Derek Lam was speaking up here, and I mean, I have a lot of experience of talking to Chinese university leaders, and their position, of course, is somewhat different to Hong Kong university leaders, so maybe we can save this for discussion, because I wanted to play a little bit the advocatus diaboli here and talk about something else, about us. Paul has asked me to be a discussant in this panel, and when he invited me to do so, he even reminded me of LMU's own past. Once every year in winter, we proudly remember the courage of Hans and Sophie Scholl, two LMU students who in 1944 were arrested for having distributed pamphlets against Adolf Hitler. The university has tried to establish a liberal tradition after the war, and as I just said, we are celebrating this proudly once every year. But the question is whether free speech in a country like ours right now is the same as free speech under Adolf Hitler or under other such governments. Our tradition, our liberal tradition, was first tested in 1968, a movement that most people are very proud of, but that also had some problems. There were student protests at LMU, as at many other universities all over Europe, all over the Western world. I'm much too young to know very much about these events. And since I'm not an alumnus of LMU, with regard to this year, I know much more about my alma mater in Hamburg than about Munich. When I was a student in Hamburg in the mid-80s, one of my professors of philosophy, a conservative man who looked extremely old to me, he must have been about my age now, he told me about his own experiences at the university when leftist students had brought carpenters from Hamburg Harbor who first raised him above this teacher's desk here in class, showed him to the students, and then locked him up in his room for 24 hours. So much for free speech at that time. My own field, Chinese studies, was deeply divided in 68 and after, and also in the 70s, since some of the younger generation had become Maoists at that time, while almost half of the professors of Chinese studies in Germany, of the somewhat but not very much older generation, had actually fled Eastern Germany when the wall was built. The real tradition of Chinese studies in Germany was in Leipzig and in Berlin, in Eastern Berlin. So they had come over in 1960, 61 or 62, and all of them shared a deep hatred of socialism and all kind of left-wing politics. So within the field there was a strong clash. This somewhat influenced the way sinology was taught in the 70s in Germany. Because of the wounds they had sustained because of political conflicts on campus, many specialists decided to do research on earlier periods of Chinese history, and here I know a story from Munich. Herbert Franke, who died at the age of 96 a few years ago, and who was some kind of the Nestor of Chinese studies in Germany, when I came to Munich, he told me that after 1968 he simply left the field of Chinese studies and became a specialist on classical Mongolian literature, because he thought that this was a better way of doing proper scholarship. I think that these clashes sometimes were not to the advantage of the development of the field of Chinese studies, and I do feel that research on Chinese history of the second half of the 20th century is still very often dominated by political convictions rather than by sound historical inquiry, and that certainly is very harmful to our field. I'm writing book reviews from time to time, and I'm very much interested in books on contemporary China, and there I have the impression, well, yes, research is important, but then conviction is what really counts. Again, I'm too young to really have seen this. When I was a student in the 80s in Hamburg, 1968 was history. As is the case in most places in Germany today, student bodies were usually elected by less than 10% of the students. To most of us, their representatives looked like remnants of a forgotten, over-politicized past. The only thing they seemed to do was to organize 1 week per semester when everybody was supposed to go on strike against or for something, the subject of which we, of course, have all long forgotten. During a visit to Berkeley last week, I was reminded by a person who studied at Hamburg before me that one of these strikes even lasted for a whole semester. My teacher, my cherished teacher in Hamburg, obviously liked these days off. since he told us that this is the week when we should focus on our students' business, and he obviously did not have to prepare class. Most of us, however, did enjoy his class and the great deal of preparation he invested in it, and thus we actually disliked our kommilitonen who had organized and forced the strike upon us. So, what I want to say here is that in good times, free speech can be nice for some, and it cannot be so nice for many others. I have to confess that, as you may have realized, my personal experiences with free political speech on campus are mixed, and recent events have confirmed this feeling. It was alluded to that in the United States, free speech now is a term that is loaded with many different meanings. When last week we visited Carol Christ, the new Chancellor of Berkeley, she was preparing for Free Speech Week. And actually I wanted to bring a newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicler, that had many reports on this. And one of my friends, who is a professor at Berkeley, said that the San Francisco Chronicler is the enemy of Berkeley campus. So Carol Christ was preparing for Free Speech Week that had been organized by some students, she said 4 or 5 students, who belong to the American alt-right movement, and they had invited Steve Bannon. I think this week he must have been there, actually, although last week they didn't know whether he was going to come. So they had prepared this Free Speech Week, obviously because they wanted to prove that free speech did not exist on campus in Berkeley, since it is well known as a place that is dominated by other political convictions with very clear ideas on many political issues. And free speech, of course, goes back to 1968 there, and is a very cherished right. The Washington Post has, with some, in my opinion, strong pathos, nominated Carol Christ Distinguished Person of the Week for her handling this affair. She has decided to allow the Free Speech Week to happen after several attempts to invite right-wing politicians in Berkeley had not been allowed before. And then she has sent a strong message about this to students and faculty at Berkeley, in which she underlines her own liberal stance. I do think that the way she handled that matter was, in the current situation, the only possible solution, and that she really has proven good leadership. But it does, of course, come at a high price. And you just mentioned security measures. Of course, this Free Speech Week on campus in Berkeley does cost the University of Berkeley, California, a hell of a lot of money for security measures, money that the university, that is under some financial pressures right now, desperately needs for other things. So faculty in Berkeley, although most people are very liberal, is quite divided over what should actually be done with this. We have had our own experiences at LMU recently. The Campus Alternative, a youth group of the Alternative für Deutschland, which you obviously all know, has won 13% at our federal elections last Sunday. The Campus Alternative asked the Convention of Students at LMU to be accredited as a university group, a status that would have given it the right to use rooms of the convention at LMU, just as any other university student group, such as, for example, the student group of Amnesty International or other political groups. The Convention of Students then denied this, and the Campus Alternative found this unjust and went straight, not to me, but to the president. Now, unfortunately, the Convention of Students had unfortunately not only denied the Campus Alternative the right to have a room, but also the Ring Christlich-Demokratischer Studenten, which is the university group of our ruling party in Germany, the Christian Democrats. And that was clearly an undemocratic decision, since the Jusos, the group of the Social Democrats, as well as several Marxist groups, had been accredited without any problems. Now, what do you do as a president of a university when you're in a situation like that? You have to do something about this, of course. And so our consequence was that we do allow political groups to convene at LMU, all of them, also the Campus Alternative, but that we ask them to do so for academic matters or for matters that concern the university. Maybe Cecil Rhodes would be a subject that they should discuss, as you just said. But there are other issues that we don't really want to have a too long discussion on campus, because we think this is going to, at some point, it could be quite dangerous for free speech at our university. Of course, this is nothing against the idea that people such as Hans and Sophie Scholl should be speak up to a dictator. But in our situation, things look a little bit different. The right to speak up should not mislead students' groups to abuse their democratic rights and to deny rights they have themselves to other groups because they believe their political ideas are wrong. Once the general public starts to see the university as a playground for one-sided ideas uniquely, we are in deep trouble. And I think that this is something that some at our universities have not quite understood right now. This is a general feeling that is rising among the public, and I think it's also at the roots of what many people call populism. Right now, I don't like this term actually, but I think it's at the root of this, and we are going to see more protests against it in the future. The university, in my opinion, is first of all a place where good scholarship should be produced that is reliable, sound, and convincing to everybody, not one for voicing political opinions. As academics, we should try our best to convince those who finance us that we are not inclined to any side and that we do not produce studies the results of which depend on those who give us money for them or on our own political convictions. And I think the right to disagree is something that, and the way, the art of disagreement, as you just said, is something that is very important and something that we have to cherish. Results of academics should be surprising, not predictable and affirmative of any ideology. Unfortunately, the latter has been the case sometimes in our universities, but I think if university professors start to produce predictable scholarship, then they lose their raison d'être very fast. If I may draw one single important conclusion from the German experience with the Third Reich, then it is that it is our duty as university professors to educate our students to have a critical spirit and to tell them to question what they read, wherever it may be, in academic books and journals, as well as in newspapers, even The Guardian, I think, sometimes, public media, or on the internet. All of them have problems from time to time. We should be suspicious of anything that students may be thought there. Good scholarship is, as Derek Lam yesterday said, always devoted to seeking the truth, not to promoting ideologies. And no matter on which side these ideologies are and whether they look nice or bad. So far, humankind has not very often been able to produce one way that was advisable for all human beings in the same right. And I do think that progress is a very, very dangerous word. And sometimes I see in our academia that many people still very much believe in progress and one way that one road that we have to pursue. Somehow what we experience today, in my opinion, is the result of the fact that the pendulum does not always swing into one direction, but sometimes it swings back, and that may sometimes be very unpleasant. So these were the words I wanted to say. There be no absolute truth that anybody has to follow. To propagate new truths at a place where old ones are cherished, and here I agree with what has been said before, is very difficult indeed. To do it nevertheless is what I think is meant by free speech on campus, and I don't think that it's easy to do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans, for an incredibly thoughtful piece of diabolical advocacy, as you said, taking us into the area of the political inflection of free speech in your own subject area, giving us a really interesting case history from LMU and vividly exemplifying the importance of the distinction between vice president and president and the responsibilities that actually go with the leadership questions that come in when you're actually playing out matters of how to kind of navigate and negotiate issues of free speech on campus, but also for bringing in these very challenging issues around populism, a word that I think many of us feel uncomfortable with, but which is very much gaining consonance and presence just now. And for raising that fascinating issue of the emphasis on progress and the need to feel for so many people that, as it were, that's where we have to go. That's a very contested area too. So let's move on to our second discussant, and we can then throw this whole thing open to everybody. So now I'd like to invite Philippe Laura to give us his views.
Thank you so much. I think my task will be easy because most of what has been said is absolutely in line with my own experience and thoughts. I think it's very important to keep in mind that free speech has always been a contested territory whose boundaries were fought for and against across time. It was maybe not so apparent when universities were more homogeneous socially and culturally and politically, but that homogeneity was exercising a kind of constraint on the definition of free speech, because nobody was asking questions in different directions when everybody was coming from the same elite, from the same education, from having the same perspective on life. So I think starting certainly from the 1960s, and happily I was not young enough not to have known that year and the following years. I was 16 in 68, and I took extremely strong pleasure in participating in those contestation movements, and I keep in mind that in a way the problem today with free speech on campus has not so much to do with traditional politics, because this is what I learned to do in the 1960s, and for me it's very easy to take a stand when free speech is threatened, when that threat comes from people who represent organized forces in society, that is, when they reflect organized movement, political parties and so on, because here as leaders, academic leaders, we only have to stand to our principle, that is to give freedom to express themselves to people who, in any case, are citizens of our countries, have that right. My problem comes from the shift in society that expressed themselves in a shift from the concept of harm, which was central to John Stuart Mill's definition of freedom of speech, that is, your freedom stops whenever you are causing harm to others, to the concept of offense. Because to cause offense to other people is not quite the same as to cause harm. And here it creates a lot of discussion because obviously in our diverse world we have to respect diversity of belief, of political preference, but also of sexual preference, of social, aesthetic, and so on preferences. And then the discussion becomes more difficult. And I would like to illustrate this with just two cases coming from my own small institution. We have about 1,000 postgraduate students coming from all over the world. That is, not even 10% of our students are from Switzerland, and the majority come from outside Europe. So obviously this is a reflection of the diversity of our world, and we, as we live in the heart of international Geneva, we are surrounded by representatives from 180 countries. So my first example is when we organized a roundtable with 3 Nobel Prize winners to discuss the promotion, the problems of human rights in the world today. And among the guests was the Dalai Lama, and which immediately caused the China permanent mission to the UN to send an email to every mission and to every international organization in Geneva to express their strong disagreement for that roundtable, inviting all diplomats and all people not to go to the Graduate Institute for that roundtable. Following which the Chinese ambassador to Bern, that is to Switzerland, wrote me an email to remind us that we have a large number of Chinese students, many of whom have a state scholarship. So that was a very sympathetic message, exerted pressure on the Swiss government, whose chairman, whose president was supposed to go to Beijing for a state visit, and said if the roundtable is taking place, the state visit will be cancelled. So I had also the Swiss government on my back to ask if the roundtable was really worth, the cancellation. And we held a roundtable, nothing happened. But just to tell, this is classical, and I don't give a damn to any leader in management affairs that would take the right decision, because the decision is easy to take, even if it has consequences. The other example involved the Europaeum, and I'm glad that Paul Flatter is with us, because he was part of the organization of that roundtable, which which involved José Barroso, a member of the Board of Trustees, and Norbert Hofer, the Austrian right-wing or extreme right-wing leader who nearly got elected as president of Austria by a slight margin. And our student got completely incensed by this roundtable and came to me with very strong words and and many emotions. And here is the point. They didn't argue in terms of free speech. They argued in terms of offense. That is, Norbert Hofer words were going to offense the integrity and beliefs of students who were themselves immigrants. They were themselves coming from parts of the world and particularly from the Muslim world, which is right at the center of the attacks and rhetoric of populist movements. And this is much more difficult to argue against, because obviously everyone has a right to his or her own preference, beliefs, and so on. And so we managed to persuade our students to have one of them reading a statement when the roundtable was ended and the floor was given to the audience. And then the students just showed posters to the participant, to the roundtable, with sentences expressing their engagement, their commitment to immigrants and the refugees in Europe. So we maintained this, let's say, silence, and it was accompanied by a reiteration of our charter, which obviously include respect for diversity, respect for human rights, and so on. So what I'm trying to say is, today, the task for us leaders in academic affairs is probably more difficult in the sense that we are going to have less and less students representing organized forces in the society at large, and representing more sensitivities and preferences that oblige us to find ways to let them express, obviously, their opinion, while keeping a strict line in terms of having people with different views coming to campus. So I think the exercise is probably more subtle than it used to be, but this is open for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Philippe has opened up some very interesting questions about the move from the relationship of freedom of speech to from association with kind of organised movements to the very interesting, and as he says, kind of subtle and nuanced questions around particular sets of sensitivities. He's also very well drawn out this question of how you strike a balance between the promotion of freedom of speech on campus in particular and the importance of not causing offence, but that itself is a contested area, and that what one person finds offensive another may find to be more or less acceptable. So how we explore these issues are big challenges for all of us.